What are the gravest threats to humanity's existence? Why have we survived so much and yet always feel on the edge of a great collapse? Understanding the existential risks that our species may face in the future is an essential part of how we plan our future as a civilization. Our next guest is Seth Baum. He's the co-founder and executive director for the Global Catastrophic Risk Institute, and he's the research affiliate for the University of Cambridge in the Center for the Study of Existential Risk. In his research, Seth has categorized the potential long-term trajectories of the human civilization and has come to an inconvenient conclusion. He tells us that, over the long term, the persistence of the status quo appears rather unlikely. Instead, civilization is likely either to die out or transform. In this conversation, we discuss the real risks behind being a human being and what it would look like for humanity to transform enough to actually survive and possibly thrive in an uncertain future. My name is Robert Roach, and this is the Type 1 Planet podcast. You can watch or listen to this episode on any of your podcasting apps. Please subscribe, share it with someone who might become inspired, and visit us at type1planet.net. All right, hello and welcome to the Type 1 Planet podcast. I'm Robert Roach, and I'm today joined by our guest, Seth Baum, co-founder and executive director of the Global Catastrophic Risk Institute. He's also a research affiliate for the University of Cambridge in the Center for the Study of Existential Risk. Seth, thanks for joining me today. So, Seth, the mission of Type 1 Planet is to reimagine and hopefully spark a redesign of our civilization so that we can enter into a long-term sustainable state that's in equilibrium with ourselves and with our planetary environment. And part of this conversation is incorporating the reality of existential risk into the way that we actually design our civilization. So I'd like to begin with a paradoxical question from one of your recent articles, assessing natural global catastrophic risks. That's the name of the article right there. And it reads, if the risk to humanity from natural hazards is so large, then why do we exist? The human species has existed for about 200,000 years, and our ancestors for even longer. Natural hazards have existed throughout this time. If they pose a significant risk, then humanity probably would have been wiped out a long time ago, and yet here we are. So, Seth, my question for you is, why is humanity still here?
Well, we're still here because we haven't been wiped out by anything yet, be it a natural hazard or something of human creation. That's the reason why we're able to have this conversation that we're having here. Had we been wiped out, then we wouldn't be able to do any of these things. But for the natural hazards, the idea is that if something like a supervolcano eruption or a major asteroid impact or so, if that was a really large risk, such that in any given year there's a pretty high probability of one of those events happening, then it would be really improbable that we would have made it through hundreds of thousands of years without one of those events happening. And so the implication of that line of thinking is that therefore the probability of one of these natural catastrophes happening in any given year must be very small. And there are some reasons to maybe question that line of thinking, and the paper that I wrote gets into some of that. And I'm happy to elaborate on that further if you'd like.
Yeah, please do. I mean, it sounds like the question is, are the probabilities of the events happening small, or the probability of that we survived larger than we thought? Is that kind of is that where the balance is, or how does it work
Well,
out?
there's more to it than that. So one important point is that while, of course, we should care about any event that would result in human extinction, that would be a very major catastrophe, we should also be concerned about events that would have very extreme, but maybe not quite that severe in terms of their consequences. Events such as the collapse of human civilization. That's something that had some event occurred that would have caused the collapse of civilization, then we would still not be talking to each other on a podcast recording, because you need civilization in order to be able to have podcast recordings like this. And so civilization, especially the advanced modern global civilization that we have today, that is a much more recent phenomenon. And take your pick of when civilization started, be it a few thousand years ago or like what we have right now, maybe even a few decades ago. And it's constantly changing and having new attributes and ways that it changes a lot faster than the risk from volcanoes and asteroids and so on would happen. And so the fact that we have survived for hundreds of thousands of years doesn't really tell us much about the threat from natural hazards to human civilization because human civilization is so much newer of a phenomenon. And probably the clearest example of this is the threat from space weather, from solar storms, things of that sort. These are events that have always occurred, but except maybe for very rare, very extreme versions of these events, they don't directly harm the human body or other biological organisms, but they do harm the physical infrastructure that makes up civilization. They will harm electrical infrastructure, railroads, satellites, things of that sort. These are all things that are much more recent. And there have been various events in which space weather has caused harm on Earth. There have been blackouts in different regions. There was one in Quebec, I think, in the late 1980s. And the potential for a larger solar storm to cause significant damage on Earth could be quite large, and that's a risk that would just not show up in the deep human history over hundreds of thousands of years because it's only much more recently that this type of event could have any noticeable impact on humanity.
So you're actually kind of referring to a fragility in the actual civilization itself, the way that we built this, the infrastructure, the technology, for example, to something like space weather. Space weather wasn't a threat to me starving to death, for example, 300 years ago, but it might be today if it takes down all of our satellites. Is that sort of what you're saying?
Exactly. Yeah, that's the right idea.
Okay. And I think in that same article that I referenced before, you said that there's a moral case for caring for human civilization to a similar degree of human extinction. So do you think that, I mean, is human civilization, are we so dependent on now on civilization to survive, or what is it that we're trying to protect? Is it our own survival or the legacy of the technology we create?
So first of all, we are very much dependent on the technological civilization for our own survival. Despite my line of work, I'm horribly prepared for any sort of catastrophe in which the electricity and the supply chains and so on aren't working very well. And I actually would encourage anybody listening to this to consider making at least some basic preparations for various disaster scenarios, like having a little extra food and maybe water and medicine at home, stuff like that. Things that could be useful even under much more mild and more frequent disaster scenarios, natural hazards, like hurricanes or earthquakes, tornadoes, stuff like that. That are pretty common around the world. I would definitely encourage people to have at least a little bit of basic preparation for that. Can definitely come in handy. That said, I don't personally. I'm embarrassed to admit I'm actually pretty bad on that front. But overall, without advanced civilization, we couldn't do what we're doing. We couldn't grow the food that we need to survive. We couldn't distribute that food from point A to point B to maintain a really large population. And we couldn't do any number of other things that help to keep us alive, be it medicine and sanitation and so on. These are the basics, plus add on to that all the more advanced technology, computer things and so on that enable us to do even more and also enable us to have more advanced versions of these basic sanitation activities in agriculture and so on. Computers are certainly used in growing food to try to improve crop yields and things of that sort. And so we need to keep civilization intact for those sorts of basic reasons. And then in moral terms, so that the the maintenance of civilization is important for us, But it's also important for the future. And this is something that I talk about in the paper, which is that if we care about future generations, and I personally am of the view that we should care about future generations, then we should especially care about things that could have a very strong impact on future generations. Human extinction is a simple example. If the species goes extinct, then we're not going to have future generations in all likelihood, unless somehow something else comes and resurrects us or whatever. But that's probably not going to happen. Um, if human civilization collapses, then there are very difficult questions about what happens next. Would the remaining human population survive? How large would the surviving population be? Um, in all likelihood, it would be quite a lot smaller than the current human population. Uh, would they be able to carry on for however many years into the future? Would they be able to recover something along the lines of the civilization that we have now? That's a really big open question. People who study this have varying opinions on this. The bottom line for me is that given how unprecedented of a situation this would be, global human civilization has never collapsed before. Fortunately, we can't say with any confidence what would happen, and so for the benefit of future generations, the best thing is clearly to prevent civilization from collapsing in the first place. And that, of course, also happens to be better for the present generation, so we don't have to go through such a really, really horrible catastrophe. And so that is an additional reason to care about the natural hazards that might or might not be a threat to causing immediate human extinction. And that would then explain why humanity as a species has survived for hundreds of thousands of years, but is nonetheless a major threat both to or could be a major threat to the current generation and potentially also to future generations.
So let's talk about those potential futures. You also wrote a paper that outlines long-term trajectories for human civilization, in which you're trying to formalize basically the possible trajectories of our species as a scientific or ethical field of study. And in this paper, you classify four potential trajectories. There's status quo, catastrophic, technological, and astronomical. So, what do each of these trajectories look like, and why is it helpful to define them in this way?
Well, so first of all, the reason to study the deep long term future of human civilization, one, it's for the potential ethical concern for future generations. The idea that just because they don't exist yet, they still count too, because maybe a human life or whatever it is should be counted the same, even if it happens to exist at a different point in time. This is a question that philosophers will debate at a lot of length, but my own view is that yes, we should care about uh, people and so on, even if they exist into the future. And then the challenge is to understand what might happen in the future, including over very long time scales. And then, likewise, to the extent that we're able to tie that back into the more practical day to day things that we can do. Because, there's a sense in which maybe we could care about the future, but if there's not much that we can do about it one way or another, then what difference does it make? And so we chart out in this paper several broad trajectories, broad directions in which human civilization could take to help us understand the sorts of actions that could be taken now that might have a large influence on what happens many years into the future. And so the four trajectories are: one, the status quo. Things stay more or less in the form that they are now. Not exactly in the same way that they are now. Human civilization's constantly changing, and there's every reason to expect that it will continue to change in a variety of ways into the future. But something that still is vaguely, broadly recognizable to us as uh, into the future, noting that, imagine looking at current civilization 100 or 200 years ago, which in the grand scheme of things is not a huge amount of time. Our civilization would be rather curious to them, like, what is this podcast thing that you are
Yeah.
talking about, that, like, what is this gibberish? But is still
But somewhat recognizable to them, you know?
vaguely, loosely recognized. That's the status quo trajectory. Then on the negative end, there are the catastrophe trajectories, and this would include human extinction. It would also include a collapse of civilization in various ways. And in the paper, we talk about collapse in terms of loss of industry and loss of agriculture. So if you rewind back in time, human civilization first developed agriculture and then later developed industry. And so perhaps we might, under certain catastrophes, not be able to retain industrial activity, but we could retain agriculture. And given the knowledge of how to do agriculture, especially to do it at a small local scale, that's, I would say, I think this is fair to say, it's a lot easier to maintain agriculture than it is to maintain industry, especially the more complex industry that we have now. Um, and so those are the catastrophe trajectories. And then finally, on the positive end, two types of trajectories: one, technological transformation, and two, astronomical expansion. Technological transformation would be some technological change that is very radical relative to these sorts of things that we're looking at now. This would include ideas like the technological singularity. This is the idea that, well, there's a few different definitions of technological singularity, but this idea that technology might change so rapidly that what the world looks like on the other side is something that just is essentially unimaginable from our perspective today. That's one interpretation of technological singularity. So that would be a different type of trajectory. Would we even be human in the usual biological sense at that point, or would we be some hybrid with machines or completely machines? These are all ideas that get discussed in this context, and those sorts of trajectories are something that would be much less recognizable, uh, much more of a deviation from the status quo compared to, say, somebody 100 years ago trying to wrap their mind around the idea of a podcast. We're still humans made out of the same DNA, and we still eat food and do all the usual stuff that would be recognizable to somebody from 100 or 200 years ago. And then finally, astronomical trajectories. This is expansion into outer space. Earth is fantastic planet. We really need to protect it. At the same time, it's a small world relative to the rest of the universe, or at least the rest of whatever portion of the universe might be accessible to us. And the possibility of expanding into outer space just opens up this huge vast opportunity for civilization to do things that go so far beyond what it's able to do on Earth, that would be another uh, uh, very different type of trajectory.
Hmm. It's interesting that astronomical is kind of the only one that changes our locate. It's a change in location less than a change of status. But when you really dive into the concept, it is fully the change of status because our time on Earth, one way or another, is limited. At some point, this planet is not going to be here, and in that very far future, if we want to prioritize some form of life, including especially our life, perhaps, but the diversity of all life continuing past the time limit of our planet and our star. That's where the astronomical phase comes in, isn't it?
Yes, exactly.
It's interesting.
And of all the things in the study of the long term future, that point you just mentioned, that our time on Earth is limited, That one is one of the most reliable insights that we have. The reason that our time is limited is because the sun eventually changes. All stars evolve. This is fairly well established astronomy at this point. And the idea that our sun will eventually it gets warmer and larger and it becomes impossible to have life on Earth as we know it. I mean, okay, maybe there are some far-fetched ideas of maybe we could relocate our planet further from the sun and stay living here a little bit longer. At that point, it might well be easier to just relocate to other planets and other astronomical objects. But one way or another, eventually our time is limited here. And if we want to continue, then we will have to go somewhere else. That much seems fairly certain, despite tremendous uncertainty about everything else that might happen between now and then.
Yeah, that's an interesting concept to consider, that we're lucky to be here in space. We're lucky to be here on this planet, which is so perfect and beautiful, but also the time that we're on this planet is so perfect and beautiful as well. A couple, million years in the future or a couple million years in the past is a totally different kind of planet potentially. Um, let's just talk really quickly about the reality that everyone knows and loves, the status quo. In your paper, you write that over the long term, the persistence of the status quo trajectories appears really unlikely. Instead, civilization is likely either to die or transform. So, what's wrong with the status quo? It appears to be doing very well, Seth. What are the primary factors behind its potential failure?
Well, if nothing else, there is that point further into the future, and this is on the order of hundreds of millions to maybe billions of years in the future, when Earth becomes uninhabitable to life as we know it. If nothing else, that's a deadline. But between now and then, that still leaves quite a lot of time. And the idea here is that civilization in its current form is in an unstable state, an unstable. I don't even know if you want to call it an equilibrium. It's like having balancing a bottle on its top instead of sitting out on its bottom like it usually would, and that it would be difficult to keep civilization balanced in its current form without it tipping in one direction or another. That either something really bad would happen when the catastrophe trajectories and that'll knock us off our course, or something that we might think of as being good would happen, expansion into outer space or technological transformation, or potentially both. I can't guarantee that things are going to go in one direction or another, but given the amounts of time that we're talking about here, thousands, millions, maybe even billions of years into the future, the odds of it staying in roughly its current form would maybe seem to be fairly low. That doesn't mean that the end is near, so to speak. There may be plenty more time for us to continue existing in roughly our current form, and arguably we should not be in any rush to leave our current form. That maybe we should take the care to, first of all, avoid catastrophe, and then, second of all, plan carefully for what we might do next. That could be debated either way, but uh, that's the idea here. That over long enough time periods, the odds of us staying in roughly our current form get smaller.
Hmm. I think a big part of the Type 1 Planet project is conceiving of a civilization model where catastrophic risk is reality, and that the civilization that you live in is dynamically able to react and also to prepare for all those potential futures. Um, so this is why I was really excited to talk to you. And you built a model for catastrophic risks. I think they're catastrophic trajectories. You sort of referred to it earlier. It's a graphic essentially. It's a forking graphic in which the civilization can drop down to extinction. It can drop down to a bare survival rate.
or down to the agriculture but no industry, and then recover to industry, and then possibly recover to technological transformation or astronomical transformation. And I'll overlay that graphic here in the episode. So if you're watching, or if you're just listening, you can open it up and watch. And so, how does a civilization prepare for all these possible futures presented on a graphic like this? How do we create? How do we even begin to create fail-safe systems that help our civilization recover the ability to perform agriculture or the ability to restart industry?
So first of all, that graphic that you're referring to doesn't cover every possible trajectory that human civilization could go on. It's really just an illustration of some directions that it could go on, some major types of trajectories. But in practice, it could go in just about any sort of direction, depending on the details. And the value of working through a graphic like that is to have a general understanding of the types of scenarios, the types of trajectories that we could be looking at. Now, as far as what exactly can and maybe should be done to prepare for these sorts of scenarios, to try to help out, shift things in a better direction, the best thing to do is to, well, first of all, prevent any catastrophes from happening in the first place. We would rather not have to deal with, are we going to lose agriculture? Are we going to lose industry? Are we going to be able to recover? It'd be better to avoid things like that from happening in the first place. And there's a whole list of things that can be done to help with that. From something that anybody can do on their own would be, say, reducing their own environmental impact, reducing their greenhouse gas emissions to address climate change. That's a simple example that pretty much each of us can do on even a day-to-day basis. And then other things like trying to avoid nuclear war. Nuclear war would be, or it could be, a very major catastrophe. Depends on the size of the war. World War II was a nuclear war, Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It wasn't a civilization ending catastrophe, but a larger nuclear war would appear to have that potential. And so preventing nuclear war from happening, that's something that, this is an ongoing focus for high level policy making around the world right now, with an emphasis on the unfortunate conflict going on in Ukraine, to ensure that that doesn't escalate to nuclear war. That's something that people are working on anyway, and this sort of long-term perspective gives us that much more that much more reason to make sure that we get it right. So that's one broad type of thing to prevent catastrophes from happening in the first place. Another, which gets less attention, unfortunately, is preparing to endure and if need be recover from catastrophes along these lines. There is some effort going into it, but much less than the effort being put in to prevent these catastrophes from happening in the first place. And yes, we should prefer that the catastrophes don't happen, but if they do, then we may benefit from having certain advanced preparations. And there's a range of different things that we could do, such as protecting critical infrastructure, arranging resources for food, water, medicine, et cetera, to give the survivors a better chance of pulling through. Um, Things of that sort. There is, I would say, not enough of that being done. It's tough. It's really dark type of activity, and it's the sort of thing that in many cases doesn't really have much value unless these hopefully unlikely catastrophes would occur. But that's another type of thing that can be done. And then on the positive side of things, there's work that can be done to advance space exploration, or to advance technology that could be transformative. The transformative technology we do have to be careful about, because things that have the potential to have a large positive transformation, in many cases, maybe even most or all cases, may also have the potential for a very large negative transformation, to themselves cause catastrophe. And so that further increases the stakes for the governance of certain classes of technology that have this really high stakes potential.
And we'll get into that in a little bit because I'm sure you're excited and ready to talk about artificial intelligence. But first, I wanted to quickly talk about nuclear war, just to bring it back for a second. Something you're well known for is describing the probability and risks around nuclear war. Um, what place does the conversation of nuclear war and specifically nuclear disarmament have in our wider conversation around existential risk? Should we be talking about it more as we've basically, we've entered into our mutually assured destruction balanced state, and other than what's recently been happening in Ukraine, we've for the most part just said, okay, we're now in that state and we're good that these weapons exist. Is that is that a safe state to be in, or is it a better state to have all of these weapons no longer exist?
Well, first of all, the extent of attention to nuclear war varies around the world. If you live in South Asia, then your attention to nuclear war may ebb and flow with the conflict in Kashmir and things of that sort. This you can do this at home. You can look up the Google web search trends for the phrase nuclear war, and then do the equivalent search for the term nuclear war translated into other languages. And depending on which language you do a search for, you get different trends over time. So if you do a search in, say, Hindi, it'll look different than the search in English. Actually, I think I haven't done this very recently, but earlier this year, if you do a search in Russian, it actually looks about the same as the search in English, just because we've all been focused on the situation in Ukraine. But if you speak Hindi, then you have a different set of situations that you're also monitoring. Uh, Events in Ukraine did register in the Hindi data, but not. It wasn't the dominant attribute of the data in the way that it was in English and Russian. Um, should we care about nuclear war? Should we be trying to reduce the risk? I think that to me is an easy one. Yes, definitely we should be. Um, there is some debate among the experts who study the impacts of nuclear war about exactly how severe those impacts would be. Uh, there's no question that the immediate local effects of nuclear detonations are overwhelmingly catastrophic. And we saw what happened in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The physics there is not ambiguous. If you detonate a nuclear weapon at a city, that city is going to be heavily destroyed, and a large portion of its inhabitants will be killed. That much is clear. But worldwide, the effects are less clear. The two big ones, one is nuclear winter. This is the effect in which the burning of whatever it is that the the detonation affects, the burning of a city or what have you, lofts smoke up above the clouds into the stratosphere as the second layer of the atmosphere. And there isn't that much mixing between the bottom layers called the troposphere and the second layer of the stratosphere. And so as smoke gets up into the stratosphere, it stays there for a longer period of time and it will it'll spread around the world. And while it's up there, it'll block incoming sunlight, and that cools the surface. That's where you get the name nuclear winter from. Um, and it does look like we probably would get some nuclear winter effect. There's more uncertainty about how severe the effect would be, and there's even more uncertainty about how well civilization around the world could manage with such a situation. And this is a point of some debate among people who study it. From my perspective, the potential for extreme catastrophic harm around the world is more than enough for this to count as a major global catastrophic risk, and likewise motivate attention um, from anyone who's trying to prevent any sort of global civilization ending catastrophe, things of that sort. And so then it comes down to what specific actions can be taken to reduce the risk. Uh, so for immediate policy purposes, a lot of it comes down to navigating the war in Ukraine so that it does not escalate to nuclear war. One thing that, as I understand it, has been quite helpful has been pressure from other countries around the world to those who are involved in the war, mainly Russia, but you don't necessarily have to focus it specifically at Russia to avoid escalating to nuclear war. And the two most important countries for that are India and China. These are, they're large, important countries in their own right, and they're also countries that have relatively good relations with Russia, and so Russia will listen to them. Russia really values their support, and so when the leaders of India and China say, hey, knock it off with all that nuclear war threats, then that's something that has a lot of potential to resonate in Moscow. And that's also a good course of action because it's something that has less downside. There are other ideas that have been discussed throughout the war, such as just letting Russia win as a way to, or letting it, negotiating a solution to keep a significant portion of the territory that they've pushed into during the war. The problem with that is that there's no guarantee that Russia will then be satisfied and would stop pursuing further aggression. There's one thing we know about Russia: you can't trust it under its current leadership. They're notoriously dishonest about their intentions and activities and so on. And so it's the downside to that sort of solution is, well, one is that you can't guarantee that this actually is a solution to the nuclear war risk because it might just buy you a little bit of time. The other is that meanwhile, the conditions in the portions of Ukraine that Russia has taken control of have been utterly horrific, and that's worth something in its own right to try to avoid that. Um, Over somewhat longer time scales, years, decades, we're not talking millions of years in the future, but over slightly longer, but still kind of normal human time scales for policy purposes, there's a lot of value to finding ways to help different countries of the world, especially the nuclear armed countries, get along with each other better. If Russia and the quote unquote the West got along with each other better, then we really wouldn't have to worry so much about nuclear war between us and them. Um, for comparison, in World War II, the United States and other countries were against Germany and Japan and Italy. And the idea of going to war against Germany and Japan now, it doesn't make sense. They're allies. We get along really well with each other, and that is a case in point that relations can change. Now, circumstances were different. We conquered Germany and Japan. We occupied them, forced a change of their government, and so circumstances were different. I don't see us occupying Moscow. That would be a huge nuclear war risk in its own right. But to nonetheless work toward better relations while recognizing the very important differences between how our countries are governed and how, say, Russia is governed, without without ignoring all of that. That is, to me, the most attractive and durable way to address nuclear war risk over longer periods of time. And that's something that I think very much should be on the overall agenda, and something that, frankly, maybe that one doesn't get as much attention as it deserves.
We are our whole dynamic since World War II or the Cold War has changed, though, since the development of the tactical nuke weaponry. It's not the H bomb anymore. It's something the size of a football that can take out a city block. So do these kinds of devices, what do these kinds of devices do to the concept of mutually assured destruction, where we're no longer threatening maybe nuclear winter with the use of one of these devices, but is this a slippery slope in some way, or is it a whole new ball game?
In nuclear security research, there is a concept called the stability-instability paradox. Now, I personally don't really think it's much of a paradox, but that is the name that the researchers use for it. And the idea is that when you have the mutual assured destruction, the threat of large-scale nuclear warfare, that might make major war less likely because countries want to avoid escalating to a major nuclear war, but it could actually make smaller conflicts more likely because both sides know that neither side wants to escalate, so you can kind of get away with smaller skirmishes. Uh, with the small scale use of nuclear weapons, that more pushes into the territory in which countries are likely to be concerned about escalation to a nuclear war. Another concept in the international security literature is the concept of a fire break. Um, if one nuclear weapon is used in a war, it's really hard to draw the line there. Like, if one weapon is used, why not two? Why not three? Why not 100? Um, and so to have a fire break at the use of any nuclear weapons is a very clean, clear, simple, obvious place to just draw the line. And so avoiding any use of nuclear weapons is important for that reason, even if a more limited small scale use of nuclear weapons wouldn't come anywhere near threatening the collapse of human civilization around the world, wouldn't cause extreme catastrophic harm to a country. You can hit a country with a nuclear weapon and cause less harm than the sum of the other activities that you do across the war. And this happened in Japan in World War II. The nuclear bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki caused an amount of damage that's small relative to the other, the firebombing of Tokyo and the sum of everything else that was done in Japan um, in World War II, let alone across other parts of the world. But because we have such large nuclear arsenals and because they're so easy to use relative to things like firebombing or artillery shelling, stuff like that, there is a compelling case for avoiding any nuclear weapons use in the first place. In addition to the harms of the nuclear bombing itself.
So let's assume, as a civilization, we've avoided or survived all of these kinds of threats and these catastrophes. We can deflect our comets. We don't destroy our agriculture through monocrop agricultural practices. We figure it out, and we are able to enter a new technological age. And let's say that, for example, we're able to create something along the lines of artificial intelligence. Is there an existential risk around artificial intelligence? What is the basis of your work on this topic?
Yes, there definitely is a risk. It's not with the AI technology that we have right now. Clearly, the AI that we have right now has a variety of important impacts on human civilization and on the world at large. And those impacts definitely merit attention. There should definitely be efforts to ensure that the AI technology that we have is used in an appropriate and a responsible fashion. However, it's not posing such a major catastrophic threat or potential for transformation. The world still looks roughly, broadly recognizable to somebody from 100 years ago and so on. The one somewhat more minor exception would be for the use of current AI technology in more critical infrastructure systems. Could be military systems, the use of AI for nuclear weapons, which, as I understand it, is actually fairly limited. Um, but sure, if an AI helps cause a nuclear war, then yes, that could be catastrophic. But in that case, you still have the nuclear weapons doing most of the heavy lifting. Uh, The idea is that perhaps at some point in time in the future, there's a lot of debate about if or when this might happen. AI technology would become significantly more advanced than what we have right now, and could have much more dramatic impacts on human civilization and on the world for better or for worse. And my own view on this is that while we can't count on anything like this happening anytime soon, the stakes are so high that it's worth at least some effort to try to ensure that um, if anything's going to happen, it would be for the better.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So let's, how do we ensure that it goes for the better? You've done a lot of writing about corporate governance. What does long-term corporate governance around AI look like?
Broadly speaking, there are two options. You can, or two types of things to do. One is to not build bad AI, and the other is to build good AI. And so that's the starting point. You have to look at where and how the AI is being made, who's involved in it, what they're doing. You have to look at the details of the technology itself to have design elements within the technology to ensure that it can be used in a safe and responsible fashion. Currently, most work on AI is being done at some combination of universities and academic research institutes and private corporations. There is some work being done directly by governments and nonprofits and so on, but that's at a smaller scale. And as is often the case, the universities and academia are more involved in basic research, and the corporations are more involved in applying the technology. Um, some of the corporations include, among the largest corporations in the world, Microsoft, Google, et cetera, et cetera. And the role for corporate governance in this is to try to orient the work being done at corporations in a way that is in line with the public interest. However, the public interest is to be defined, and can have a whole conversation about that. This includes work being done within the corporations themselves. Corporations are not destined to pursue their activities in any one particular way. There are people within the corporations um, uh, who a lot of them really care about doing the right thing with their technology, and are involved in trying to help shift the company's work in better directions, and that's really important. There's also work to be done from outside the corporations. This includes government regulation. It includes efforts, within public conversations, the media, and so on, to keep tabs on the companies, identify things that they might be doing wrong, pressure them to do things right. And so, for people from a lot of different backgrounds, there are constructive opportunities to help shift this work in the right direction. And that's specifically for corporate work. For more academic research, there's also a lot to be done there in terms of orienting the research in positive directions, where a big point is to orient the overall field of AI toward having high ethical standards and high standards for safety and so on. Historically, that hasn't been the case. Historically, it's been much more about just developing AI for its own sake, or for the intellectual project of developing AI. It was an interesting research area, and maybe impressive to see how capable of an AI we could get. Uh, it's not a field like, say, medicine or civil engineering that has just a really long-standing norm of doing what's in the overall public good. And so shifting the norms within the field, and shifting the accompanying activities within the field, that's another important area of activity.
Well, Seth, it kills me to cut us off because I want to dive so much more deeply into all of these topics. But I really wanted to thank you for your time today. We've covered a lot of amazing and complicated and really interesting topics. There's the last question I have for you is, you know, if you could sit down maybe on a virtual roundtable or in person somewhere in New Jersey, between New Jersey and New Haven, to either collaborate or debate or continue diving deeply into these ideas, what kind of people or organizations would you want to talk to continue these conversations?
Well, the type of conversation that I think is especially valuable is between those who, perhaps like myself, uh, have some understanding of these more distant future possibilities, who have some understanding of the catastrophic risks that we face. And then, on the other hand, those who may be at the front lines of actually doing things about it. And that can include people who don't necessarily have much of a focus on these topics. And this to me is really the heart of the matter is how do you take these really big, really wonderful ideas, important ideas, and bring them down to earth, so to speak. How to translate them into constructive practical action that can really make a difference in orienting human civilization and the world in a good direction. And part of the issue is that not everybody shares our interest in these sorts of topics. It's great to have this interest. I definitely encourage that that interest in anybody who's into this sort of thing. At the same time, we live in a pluralistic society. People have a lot of different perspectives and backgrounds and so on. And so to be able to craft constructive solutions that can make a big difference on the risks and on the future more broadly, that will make sense from the perspective of people who actually need to take these actions. There's a conversation to be had there. And that's something that I definitely encourage.
I think that's a big part of what this show is about, is that there's so many people with and organizations with similar missions or even tangential missions that actually fit nicely together, but they don't know each other. They can't speak each other's language. And so I'm hoping to try to make those connections. So if I might need to tag you in for a future conversation if you're interested, maybe a roundtable or a debate. So I'll keep you posted, Seth. Thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you for having me.
I really appreciate it. All right.